Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 17th chapter of the first book of Kings. Herein we are introduced to Elijah, the mightiest prophet in the Old Testament, but the historical context is established in the 16th chapter, and the northern kingdom of Israel, whereas the southern kingdom of Judah did not suffer from any power struggles. They had dynastic stability. The one who sat on their throne was a direct descendant from the line of David all the way to Zedekiah, but Israel was not so fortunate. They had power struggles in dynasties that thus far they are on their third dynasty already. By the time Asa, I think he's the great grandson of Solomon. So they keep supplanting. They're assassinating. The second dynasty, Jeroboam's dynasty, is removed from him because of his apostasy. So his son reigns, and then someone kills his son, establishes his own reign. His son is Baasha. We read of him in the 6th verse. Then it passes to Elah, I think his son. So this is the second dynasty, and then he is supplanted by a servant by the name of Zimri, who is in command and control of half of his chariots. He rules for 7 days, but then Omri, the founder of the third dynasty of Israel, is recognized by the army. He's in the command and control of the army. Even so, he besieged Zertha. This was the capital city before Omri's the one who elevated Samaria to the capital city of the northern kingdom. But he had a power struggle between himself and a rival contender known as Tibni, son of Ginath. But he emerged triumphant, and he bought the city of Samaria. It was a hill that belonged to an owner named Shemer. But in spite of this, he did evil to an unprecedented extent. So the third dynasty was even eviler than the one that came before it, and the one that came before the first one was evil. So they speak of following in the footsteps of Jeroboam. He is the one who set the inexorable march of idolatry in the northern kingdom, the first king. Then we read of Ahab, the son of Omri, who is the king, and his queen Jezebel are the opponents and enemies of Elijah, the mightiest prophet. These are the wickedest monarchs in the history of the northern kingdom, and they are what Manasseh was to the southern kingdom. Ahab was more his wife's creature, so Jezebel really survives as the prototype of the evil, idolatrous monarch. In the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, Ahab son of Omri became king over Israel, and Ahab son of Omri reigned in Israel in Samaria 22 years. 29th verse. So his reign, he does establish a long reign, and so too did Manasseh. He ruled for 55 years, but longevity is not necessarily an endorsement. So the year that he took the throne was in 874. He would end up being licked by dogs at his death in the year 853, but his son, he did pass the throne on to one of his sons, so there was some dynastic continuity after him. And Ahab son of Omri did evil in the eyes of Yahweh more than all those before him. Like father, like son, corruption is accumulative. Evil people get worse and worse and worse with each passing generation. This momentum was almost set in motion by Jeroboam, but he certainly, like father, like son, so he outdid his father in his wickedness, and he sets the standard, really, for the kings of the north. And it came to be as though it had been a light matter for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, son of Naphtah, that he took a wife, Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Zidonians, and he went and served Baal and bowed himself to it. So they were a covenant nation, and the kings of the covenant nations were commanded to carry portable copies of the Torah. The Torah was nowhere in this man's hand, nowhere on his mind, nowhere in his heart. That's why he was seduced and led astray by the pagan foreign entities of his wife. Now, she may have been of the dynasty of Hiram. We're not exactly sure. The one with whom Solomon had the commercial conducting between them had enabled the building of the temple. But Baal was the pagan, the Phoenician. So Zidon was a city-state in Phoenicia, which is the modern country of Lebanon to the north of the Promised Land. And Baal was was a Canaanite fertility deity. He was the storm god, without whom, that's who the Canaanites looked to for the abundance of their agricultural abundance. They prayed to him, and Israel found itself in a drought and famine because this king had set up shop for Baal worshiper and raised up an altar and built a house in Samaria. And Ahab made Ashtaroth, and Ahab did more to provoke Yahweh Elohim of Israel than all the kings of Israel before him. Once more it is reiterated and established that this was evil on an unprecedented scale and perhaps unduplicated. So Ashtaroth, these were poles, pagan idolatry, and Baal was the specific deity whom he had introduced. And in the 18th chapter, Elijah truly establishes the dominance of Yahweh over this imaginary entity. But we meet him first in the 17th chapter, verse 1. And Elijah the Tishbite of the inhabitants of Gilead said to Ahab, As Yahweh Elohim of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there shall be no dew or rain these years, except at my word. Elijah's name translates as Yah is my Elohim. Yahweh is my Elohim, Yah. His name was indicative of his message, the Elohim whom I serve. So he belonged to him in a very special way. He was his prophet, and one of the jobs of the prophets was to pronounce judgment on wicked kings and wicked people and wicked nations, and that's what we see here. The famine and the drought was apostasy induced, and he has this message from the prophet. They had the covenant and they were promised curses and consequences for deviating from it, so they really had no one to blame. Why wasn't there rain coming down? Because the agricultural outgrowth would have been reliant on the rains to fall down in the spring, April and March, and the autumn, October and November, as we measure our calendars. But for 3 years, none of this happened because the king would not relent. But the prophet approached him, and he did his job. And the word of Yahweh came to him, saying, Go away from here and turn eastward and hide by the Wadi Kerith, from which flows into the Jordan. The word of Yahweh was something not only that they spoke, but also something that was spoke to them. So Elijah is a oral prophet, to be distinguished from written prophets. Written prophets have books which bear their names. There are 12 of them, the 12 minor prophets, and then there are 4 major prophets. But a lot more of the prophets that we read about in the Bible, there are significantly north of hundreds of prophets scattered throughout the Old Testament. They're, in the book of Judges, Abraham is one, in Genesis 20. So there's a lot more prophets than just the ones who have their name. And Elijah survives as the standard and the prototype. And he had the divine direction to survive when the drought and famine that he personally pronounced he would be provided for, while those in the Promised Land suffered the consequences of their own apostasy-induced drought and famine. So the Jordan River would have been the eastern extremity of the Promised Land. While the Promised Land is suffering from drought, this prophet is provided for by ravens in the sky who give him his daily bread, much as the manna had fell from the sky for the Exodus generation. And it shall be that you drink from the stream, and I shall command the ravens to feed you there. Ravens are at his command and his control, and he is capable of raining manna from the sky. Sometimes he might bring it in through the mouth of a raven. So he was the provider. The birds were the transporters. They're the ones who brought the food that would have been necessary for him to survive as a recluse and an ascetic in the wilderness. So Elijah, he was not clad in comfortable clothes or anything, and he did not subsist on a luxurious diet. He had a hard, rugged life, but he was provided for nevertheless, and that was enough. And he went and did according to the word of Yahweh, for he went and dwelt by the Wadi Kerith, which flows into the Jordan. he obeyed, and this is the responsible response. And one of the reasons now we witness in the 13th chapter of this book a prophet who disobeyed the word, and it did not end well for him. He did not make it out he was marred by a lion on the road. But Elijah obeyed, and the obedience and the lack thereof is a life or death issue. So the greater levels of personal revelation that we will receive, revelation is not the exclusive possessions of prophets. We can read, dig, and discover personal revelations for our own. But if you want to advance to progressive layers, you have to handle responsibly the contents of the personal revelation you had received in order to be trusted with more. So obedience is what separates the wise from the weak. And the ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the stream. He had at least 2 meals a day, one in the morning, one in the evening, possibly 3, but in any case, the ravens were the transporters. Yahweh was the provider. He's the one who provided the daily bread, and he also had plenty to drink from the stream. So even though there was no rain falling from the sky, there was still drinkable water in the river. And it came to be after a while that the stream dried up, because there had been no rain in the land. So as the drought and the famine progressed worse, the stream became no more. This is a common thing in desert terrain. Desertification is when rivers, so the Sahara Desert was once lush jungle territory, much like the sub-Saharan now is, but it desertified over the passage of time, and we witness a smaller scale of the same phenomenon in effect in here. So the stream that was once there is now no more. This means Elijah has to get up and move somewhere else, but thankfully he still has the word to provide for him and guide him, and also to protect him. Then the word of Yahweh came to him, saying, Rise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Zidon, and dwell there. See, I have commanded a widow there to sustain you. Zidon was the territory of Jezebel, and she survives as the wickedest standard monarch. To speak of a woman as being Jezebelian, I've heard that used in reference to Hillary Clinton, and is not a flattering designation. And in the book of Revelation, a certain prophetess who led a certain people to sacrifice to idols and engage in sexually immoral prophetess is assigned the name Jezebel. But in any case, part of the providential paradox is that Yahweh's prophet, who is on the run from this woman who hailed from the region, would have solace and refuge in the region from which she was her native land. And so he'll be out of her reach, and he'll have this widow that is put there to provide for him and to sustain him, and he's going to be integral to his survival. And he rose up and went to Zarephath, and came to the gate of the city, and saw a widow there gathering sticks. And he called and said to her, Please bring me a little water in a vessel to drink. Again, he has the obedient response. He goes up and he follows. He makes the most out of the voice that he is not disobedient to the message or the vision. And while there, he spots a widow who's gathering sticks, and he senses that this is the one, because he has the promise that there will be a widow provided, and he sees this widow and recognizes it as her, and true to the promise of Yahweh that he will be provided for, he asks for a water to be sustained. And as she was going to get it, he called and said to her, Please bring me a piece of bread in your hand. Daily bread and daily water, these are the two. Food and water are integral to our survival, so we need them both, and we cannot last long without either. And so he has his thirst satisfied, but he still has a growling stomach, and this widow is to test whether she is the one that has been sent to provide for him. He requests this again. And she said, As Yahweh your Elohim lives, I do not have bread, only a handful of flour in a bin, and a little oil in a jar. And see, I am gathering a couple of sticks, and shall go in and prepare it for myself and my son, and we shall eat it and die. So she is not a devotee or a worshiper. She is not a converted Gentile. She speaks to Yahweh as your Elohim, not our Elohim. So she's just giving him the due deference of swearing on his God. The pagan polytheist would have considered him the native God of Israel, not the universal creator. But she swears that she does what little bread she has is going to be consumed by her and her son, and then they fully expect to die because there is no more food in the land. But what she has becomes sufficient to sustain the prophet in his survival on the run. And Elijah said to her, "Do not fear. Go and do as you have said, but make me a small cake from it first, and bring it to me, and afterward make some for yourself and your son." So he gives her the assurance. Fear is is an understandable predicament when you are surrounded by famine and at its mercy and its grips. But he says, tend to me first, because if you bless me first, the blessings will extend to you, and I treat me with the due deference as you would a guest if you had enough to provide, and then there will be enough and then some for you and your son, not only for now but for a while, to sustain you while this drought and famine is consuming. But so this famine would have spread to Phoenicia, and Phoenicia had been dependent on the nation to the south, Israel, for the provision of their food since the days of Solomon. That was one of the arrangements in the temple construction. For thus said Yahweh Elohim of Israel, the bin of flour shall not be used up, nor the jar of oil run dry, until the day Yahweh sends rain on the earth. So that's a pretty reassuring promise, and it is ultimately a leap of faith for this pagan this Gentile woman who doesn't even believe in Yahweh as her Elohim, embraces or is told this promise in his name and in his power, and she comes ultimately to an assumption that her son is dead on account of her sin. And so she feels threatened by the presence of the prophet. But we'll get there when we get there. For now, they have the wonderful assurance and the comforting promise of having their provision satisfied until the rain finally returns to the earth and replenishes the ground. They're going to be taken care of. They're not going to be starving. So she went and did according to the word of Elijah, and she and her household ate for many days. So she obeyed the word of Yahweh, which was spoken to her by the prophet. The prophet was communicated from Yahweh to, the promise was communicated from Yahweh to his prophet, and he was obedient and she was obedient. She maybe only had a mustard seed of faith, but it was certainly enough to obey, and she was rewarded for her faith. The bin of flour was not used up, nor did the jar of oil run dry, according to the word of Yahweh, which he spoke to by Elijah. The word of Yahweh is as good as gold. It is promised and settled, and it is true, even if it has yet to manifest. His words, his promises are ironclad. His promise is set in stone already. So even if, and some of the promises demand patience, but we witness an immediate effect. They keep having food the next day and the day after that and the day after that. Formerly they were preparing to eat what little grain they had to make a loaf of bread, and the widow and her son were expecting to die, being famished from the famine. And after these events it came to be that the son of the woman who owned the house became sick, and his sickness was very severe, until there was no breath left in him. So there was a widow and a fatherless one, so this would have been a single mother, an almost impossible living situation in the ancient world, and to have your son, what's the last thing left perhaps of the husband you once had, to become sick, fatally sick, very severe illness. So this was pushing him to the brink of death, and it ultimately consumed him and killed him, whatever this sickness was. And she arrives at the notion, influenced by pagan spirituality, personal calamity is the response. She is personally responsible for the calamity of her son through her own sin. So she does have a sense of conviction in the presence of the prophet, in the presence of divinity. But this sickness, the purpose of this fatality was to prove that he has the power to bring life from the dead. So Elijah was in fact the mightiest prophet as measured by miracles. No one else ever raised from the dead. No one else, except with the exception of Enoch, escaped death. He was translated to heaven in the 2nd chapter of 2 Kings. And she said to Elijah, "What have I to do with you, O man of Elohim? Have you come to me to bring my wickedness to be remembered and to kill my son?" The remembrance of the wickedness would have had the consequential effect of killing her son. And again, this idea is influenced highly by pagan spirituality. It's an archaic theology, but there is some truth in the principle of divine justice, that the wicked will reap what they sow, and the wages of wickedness, the wages of sin, is death. But this son did nothing wrong, and the widow did nothing wrong. She was providing for the prophet, giving him sanctuary and refuge, while he was public enemy number one in the palace's mind, on the palace's list. And he said to her, "Give me your son." So she took him from her arms and took him to the upper room where he was dwelling, and laid him on his own bed, and cried out to Yahweh and said, "O Yahweh, my Elohim, what have you also brought evil on the widow with whom I am sojourning, to kill her son?" So the physical protocol and process with which he prostrates himself through prayer, but more specifically by stretching himself over the recently deceased son. We don't know how old he is, but he's certainly a male and certainly a son. And the prophet is physically stretching himself, and then he says the same thing in prayer 3 times, in fact. So he repeats the same thing. "O Yahweh, my Elohim." His name once more translates as Yahweh is my Elohim. Elijah. So the suffix actually goes before the prefix as we translate it in the English language, but that's what his name does mean. And once more he calls him my. So this is distinct from the widow who called him yours. So it does make a difference when we know him as our personal deity and personal savior, and a very present help in times of danger. And in such a situation, this is when even the atheists become believers. When it's the brink of the death, they'll just have a fool's hope and a mustard seed of faith that someone somewhere out there in the universe is capable to restore the deceased back to life. And Yahweh heard the voice of Elijah, and the life of the child came back to him, and he lived. The prophet has the unique relationship of not only hearing the voice, but also having their voice heard. Their prayers are treated specially, and the ones who Yahweh speaks to, he's going to value and pay attention to what they speak to them. And a lot of times it's just... there's just confessions of inadequacy, certainly at the initial theophanic revelation. But he spoke to him, and Yahweh spoke to him, as I'm speaking to you now. And but what he spoke to Yahweh heard, and he was restored, so he was resurrected. This is an Old Testament precedent to the resurrection to come. So before the first fruit of the resurrection was died and rose from the grave after 3 days, he did resurrect a few people: the daughter of Jairus, the synagogue ruler; Lazarus, the sibling, the brother of Mary and Martha; and I think one other on a funerary procession. And Elijah took the child and brought him down from the upper room into the house and gave him to his mother. And Elijah said, "See, your son lives." So that is a mother's best joy. It's probably even more joyous than the difference between giving birth and holding that recently born son who had just recently caused you so much exquisite agony in your hand. To have someone lost and to have them, there's literally nothing like it that we can relate to, so we can only imagine, and it's incalculable to even fathom the extent and the depths and the degrees and dimension of her joy at these words. To have the child in hand and being told that he is living and being brought in living proof. And the woman said to Elijah, "Now I know this. I know that you are a man of Elohim, and that the word of Yahweh is in your mouth is truth." So she's not quite at the level of faith in Yahweh, but she does have faith in his prophet. She's seen the miracles she's experienced. She knows that there is some supernatural power not only providing for her food and for the resurrection of her recently deceased son, who was severely sick, and then he had ultimately consumed him, choked him, and killed him, whatever this sickness was. So she knows that he is a man of Elohim, and that the word of Yahweh in your mouth is truth. So she's getting close to a conversion. It's ultimately speculative as to whether she is quite there yet, but in any case, she is responding in faith and obedience. So she does so some admirable traits, despite her confused reason for the purpose that her son would die. She thought it was for her own sins. It was for the demonstration of the power of Yahweh to bring life where there is death. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.